Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's event with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. My name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the Council. We are so excited that you've decided to join us either in person, well, not in person, online live, or watching the recording of this event, our first in the three-part series for the fall T. Williams and Patricia Ayers Global Tipping Point series uncovering conflict. We're so excited to have Charles Sennott with us here today, but I want to say a few words and thank a few people before we get to tonight's conversation. So first and foremost, I'd like to mention that the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that looks to help people better understand the world through community conversations. That includes our speakers programs, our podcasts, our international visitor exchanges, and our high school diplomacy simulations. So I want to thank all of our members, donors, and sponsors for helping to make these programs free and available to the public. Last year, we had over 26,000 engagements in all of our programs, and it is because of this wonderful community that we are able to achieve great things. Now, speaking of sponsors, I want to quickly turn it over to the president of the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association and a sponsor of this series, a long-term sponsor of this series. So Kimberly, please take the stage.
Hi, thank you all for coming today. We are thrilled that we were able to receive a grant and support this series, the Tipping Point series. If you don't mind, I'd like to share a little bit about what the Fulbright Association mission is, and I'll just read that very quickly and we'll get on to our topic. So what is the Fulbright Association? It was established in 1977 as an independent nonprofit and the American alumni organization of the Fulbright program. Since its inception in 1946, Fulbright scholarships have facilitated over 400,000 academic and professional exchanges across 165 countries, promoting cultural understanding and reducing conflict, our topic today. With 54 local chapters, the association furthers the Fulbright mission by connecting global Fulbrighters and their ideas, supporting career development and mentorship, and advocating for the future of the Fulbright program. Our vision is a peaceful and cooperative world advanced through international educational exchange and cultural immersion. And our history is in 1976, the Board of Foreign Scholarships, now the J. William Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, created the Fulbright program. And the Fulbright Association grew out of that with resolutions adopted by those meetings. So finally, who are the Fulbright alumni? They are leaders in every field and represent over 165 countries. They are global change makers in politics, business, science, education, and the arts. Our ranks include 89 Pulitzer Prize winners, 61 Nobel Prize laureates, 40 current or former heads of state or government, and 76 MacArthur Foundation fellows, and 16 Presidential Medal of Freedom recipients. So our alumni come from thousands of public and private universities around the United States. And Fulbrighters are committed to advancing mutual understanding, tolerance, and peaceful relations worldwide. I will mention, I'm a professor at St. Anselm College, where I'm Fulbright Program Advisor, and a wonderful coincidence, one of our alumni who won a Fulbright, Katie McGilvray, is the niece of our speaker tonight. So without further ado, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kimberly, for that warm welcome and for the support of the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association. We really appreciate your help in making these kind of events possible and to really spread the word about the importance of global understanding. So thank you so much for that. All right. So as a nonpartisan membership-based organization, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire does not take stances on policy or politics or parties or anything of that nature. Any of the questions you hear tonight, any of the responses from our speaker are the thoughts and opinions of each person and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, its board, staff, members, donors, sponsors, and anyone else you can think of at this point. So thank you for that. Thank you for your attention. And I'd love to now bring Charlie on the virtual stage with us here. Charlie founded Ground Truth in 2014, but in 2017 spun that off into a new media group called the Ground Truth Media Partners. It is a wonderful opportunity to really approach journalism in a new way in the new world that we find ourselves in. He also, very importantly to tonight's conversation, reported from 20 different frontline countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, multiple countries during the Arab Spring earlier in the 2000s. And most importantly, he was the most recent recipient, last year's recipient of the World Press Freedom Award from the Foley Foundation, a wonderful partner of ours, and someone who really impacted Charlie's life as well. Jim Foley, working with Charlie at the Global Post, another project that Charlie helped to co-found. And the final one that I'll mention with all of these fun little connections that we seem to have is Charlie's group was instrumental in creating the Report for America Corps, which allows small local media companies to have fresh, bright-eyed journalists come to their communities, help to expand the coverage in those areas. So I'm sure we'll talk about all of this throughout the evening. But Charlie, I'd love to turn it just to you for any initial comments.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks so much for the warm shout out to my niece. Thanks to the professor for saying that. She was a Fulbright and she learned so much. She was in Argentina. So thanks. I love the World Affairs Council. I'm honored to be on. Thanks to all of you who are here. And Tim, I would guess that if I were listening in, I might wonder, how is it that someone like myself, a journalist, could do all this international reporting and then, start a program called Report for America, which really focuses on local journalism. And I think that idea that local journalism and global journalism are woven together is something that really I've built my journalism around, and I believe in it deeply. And I want to, if I could, I thought I might share a story of sort of how I began as an international reporter, which is actually a very local news story. Is that an okay story to share as a starting point, and it'll launch us in?
Sounds wonderful.
Okay. So in 1993, I was a police reporter in New York City for the New York Daily News, which is New York's local newspaper. They call it New York's hometown paper. Very local. Cops were one of the big beats to cover there. I had a ridiculous mullet, like, remember those haircuts? And I loved my job so much. It was a job doing street reporting. And in 1993, I heard a very loud bang in Lower Manhattan. I was out at a diner and I heard this bang, and no one knew what it was at first, but then I heard a lot of sirens. So I started walking toward where people were running from. And as I got closer, it was the World Trade Center. And this was 1993. And the World Trade Center smoke was pouring out of the parking garage of the World Trade Center. My job as a local police reporter was to find out what is going on. So I went there and I could see people were terribly afraid. They were running. They had soot and on their faces. They were suffering from smoke inhalation, really afraid. No one knew what had happened. And I got to the World Trade Center and I kind of got down in and was able to get past the police lines and see, as they were stringing emergency lighting, that it was an explosion. And the mayor at the time was saying that it was a generator explosion, but I had been covering Medellin, Colombia, and I had covered Belfast in Northern Ireland. And I knew what a bomb looked like, and I believed it was a bomb. And my city editor, Billy Boyle, who I called from the payphone just outside of the parking garage where I saw this hole, said, "That's great that that's what you think, but the mayor says it's a generator explosion." And if only we had sort of FaceTime, phones back then, I would have been able to show him that as we were talking, the bomb squad was arriving down into the parking garage. And I think that's a moment in time. And for those of you who are following along, you'll know that's the first big terrorist attack in America. It's the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. It was the one carried out by a small cell of militants who wanted to take down the World Trade Center. They failed in 1993. They killed 6 people, and they caused damage to the parking garage. But New York City sort of shrugged it off. And as we would learn 8 years later, that cell that carried out that attack in a truck bombing down in the parking garage of the World Trade Center stayed with it. And 8 years later, they carried out the attacks we know as 9/11, and they succeeded in taking down the World Trade Center. So for me, it is a local journalism story, police reporting, that put me on the ground to do the story that would lead to really work that I continue to do in covering the Middle East. And that, I always like to start with that. People wonder, how do you become a foreign correspondent? For me, it was being a police reporter and responding to a story. And the city editor, Billy Boyle, who was kind of amazing and legendary, saw that I was breaking all these stories. They claimed that the mastermind of this first World Trade Center bombing was a guy named, they claimed it was a Palestinian whose name was Mohammed. I'll think of it in a second. But it turned out he was the one, his name was Mohammed Salameh. Mohammed Salameh was the one who had been found because he went back to collect the deposit on the Ryder truck rental that was used in the bombing. That's how they figured out who he was. So when I broke that story, I knew we were undercutting their notion that he was the mastermind, because clearly this guy was not too bright. And there was a much wider network and a cell that was operating. And Boyle said, you should just cover this story. This should be your story. You're breaking all these angles on it. You're figuring out who wanted to blow up the World Trade Center. And again, it was 1993. Why don't you go to the Middle East and figure this out? And that is how I became a Middle East correspondent. That's how I really became someone who traveled that part of the world. And eventually the Boston Globe hired me to be the Middle East bureau chief. And Boston is my home. So we share the Red Sox, most of your viewers, I would imagine, and myself. And I came home to the Boston Globe, but I was quickly sent to cover the Middle East and really covered all of the stories that led up to 9/11 and covered 9/11 in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. So long way of saying global and local is very much a part of how I think of conflict reporting.
Well, that's a great place to start, especially at the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, because we try to tie the local to the global and the global to the local every day. So thank you for bringing that in. I think the place to go from here is to sort of zoom out. And one of the things that we want to do with this series is to talk about the importance of conflict journalism. Obviously, as we've seen time and time again, journalists put themselves in very serious danger. Many of them, including James Foley, lose their lives doing something that they are passionate about, but also know is very important. So can you talk to us a little bit about what that experience looks like? What do you see? What do you do as a conflict journalist? And how do you try to keep yourself safe throughout that experience?
So I would start off just with a moment of recognition of Jim Foley's incredible life and the incredible tragedy and the violence that ended his life. Jim was one of the most extraordinary colleagues I worked with. He worked with us at Global Post, which, as you pointed out, I was the co-founder of that. It was a digital news organization. His work was just so extraordinary. He was truly a great storyteller. And I want to come back to Jim's story and how Jim's work there as a freelancer is a very important story to understand in the context of what is it like doing conflict reporting, because Jim had a unique experience as a freelancer. I was a staff reporter for the Boston Globe, which is different. I had the resources of a big newspaper behind me. I had people who were looking out for me, people who got things like insurance for me and a flak jacket, and who understood that I needed the right equipment, and who were there not only as my editors but also to help me think through risk assessments. And it really was important to me that I had this team behind me. So you can't really do it without that. But I would say, what is it like? I would say that the definition of a foreign correspondent covering a conflict is very much like what happened to me in Lower Manhattan on that day in that first World Trade Center bombing. You run toward places that people are running from, where you get as close as you can to a very complex situation where no one knows what's really going on, and where people are afraid, and where there are terrible things happening. And it's your job to try to shed light on that situation and to talk to human beings about what's happened here. And that's something I call ground truth. So I think that experience is sort of the definition of it, even though it was in Lower Manhattan. And you could say, what does that have to do with international reporting? Well, in my mind, being a foreign correspondent going into a conflict is no different than the way you go into any other story. It's all about ground truth. And the phrase ground truth is one that I've adopted as the name of our organization, but it's also a philosophy. And it has a very technical meaning. And ground truth is about, of course, being there on the ground. It has that obvious meaning, but it's also a technical term that was coined by NASA. And it is about calibrating what happens on the ground compared to what has happened, for example, with satellite technology. So in order to calibrate satellites, they do this process called ground truthing. And it is literally a calibration of the satellite to the actual reading on the ground. So imagine if you've used Google Earth and you know satellites are involved in that. Well, those pixels that form the picture that you see on Google Earth as it zooms down maybe into your town and then your neighborhood from space, none of that will make sense without that calibration called ground truthing. And I love that idea that that's what journalists do. We take the technology and then we try to be there on the ground and compare what we see on the ground and calibrate that against the technology so that we get an accurate reading. And I never thought of NASA as poetic, but I do love the way they define ground truth when they say ground truth is a calibration process. It involves measuring ground readings, the human reading, against technology. And as NASA describes it, when the technology and the human reading are in conflict, trust the human reading. And that's what I think conflict reporting or international reporting in general is all about. It's about trusting the human reading. There's a lot of information that bombards us every day through technology, but the readings that we get on the ground, those from human beings who are going through these situations, that's the one that we calibrate it against. And so that's why our organization is called Ground Truth. And I think that idea of ground truth, that philosophy of ground truth, is really at the center of what it is to be a conflict reporter.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think really highlights the importance of being there, of talking to people. And I think probably talking to multiple people, not just one eyewitness and taking their word for it. And that's one of the things that we wanted to also explore here is we know that conflict reporting is very chaotic. We know that there are at least two, probably more sides to the conflict. And especially with technology today, that includes AI, that includes social media, that includes many other tools, cameras in everyone's pocket, etc. how do you, as a reporter, work to uncover that truth? How do you work to take back those layers and understand, well, one side is going to be promoting one issue, one side is going to be promoting a different narrative, and how do we come to that truth?
It's a great question and deceptively challenging, maybe. But I think the key is to recognize, if you're a foreign correspondent, that you are in someone else's country. That's how I had to approach it when I was covering Afghanistan, or when I was covering Iraq or Israel, Palestine, or Myanmar. These are complicated places with deep layerings of history and politics and colonial expressions. And we have to be very respectful of where we are, and you have to know your history. So you really can't dive into asking the right questions if you don't have that historical context as your sort of widest ring of calibration as you try to come in on what are the right questions to ask. The other thing is just to be very respectful of the culture itself and the language, to know the language, to study language. My Arabic is so bad, I'm embarrassed, but the best reporters I know in the Middle East are the ones who stopped, took the time, and really learned the language. One of them is Richard Engel, who used to work with me as a freelancer when I was at the Boston Globe, and he is now, of course, the legendary NBC News correspondent. And part of his great success has been his language skill. Others I know who are great journalists, who are great not only because they're curious, but because they have the language facility for that. And I think the most important sort of quality of all is to remember that there are, as you said, there are so many perspectives. You have to be willing to listen to everything and come into it without your mind made up, and try to truly embrace all of the different perspectives that are coming at you. And then if you do that and you fairly record those different perspectives, I think you can do what is a pretty good rule of thumb in journalism in general, and definitely in foreign reporting, which is don't tell people what to think, but try to tell people what to think about. So don't tell people what to think, but definitely try your best to tell them what they need to think about if they're going to understand this situation.
So I feel like we've paid you for advertisements here, because again, that's something that we are looking to do ourselves.
Well, I love you guys.
I know, exactly. We want people to come at these conversations from a fact-based central point, but we don't want them to be told what to think. We want them to think.
I think too much reporting these days does try to come at it from a partisan point of view, or from a national point of view sometimes, and it really is not what it's all about. And the thing you can do as a foreign correspondent to really understand this is to really get to know the local journalists. And this was a big part of my journey, was realizing that these, quote, fixers, they're sometimes called, a phrase I hate, the people who we rely on to help us understand where we are, the language, how to get to different places, how to have the contacts to open us up to all these different things. They're really not fixers. It's a terrible word. They're journalists. They're reporters. They're local reporters who are there helping guide you through the story, and their role is sacred. And I know Jim Foley knew this and had tremendous respect for his local colleagues. And I think that is a central part of what Ground Truth wanted to be. And I think Jim was one of our best ever correspondents, certainly incredibly courageous and committed to that notion of wanting to tell the story fairly, to listen to everyone, to bear witness. And he understood the importance of those local colleagues. And that really got me thinking about that full circle journey in my life, that I started off covering the Middle East as a local reporter in New York City at the World Trade Center, and that story led me to Afghanistan, when 8 years after that first time I went to the World Trade Center to cover that bombing, 8 years later, when Al-Qaeda succeeded in toppling those towers, to me, that was a local story. And I had a chance to share that with local reporters in Afghanistan. And you can imagine how they feel with me as a reporter being there on their country, looking at what our country is doing as an expression of power in their country, most of the time failing to recognize that it's not the Afghan people who took down the World Trade Center. It was Al-Qaeda and the Afghans' Taliban leadership that allowed Al-Qaeda to set up shop inside of Afghanistan. If you could find it in your heart as an American then to understand that and to talk to those people who were Afghans in that way, it transformed how they dealt with you. It certainly opened your eyes to the story. And I think on some level, it can open your heart to the story, that it's more complicated than they're the enemy. And this is a war and I'm from the United States. It's layered, it's complex. There's so much history in it. Very, very deeply complex history that might be more than we have time to go into. But I think your listeners are astute and they know international affairs. So they might know that the United States actually supported the Afghan fighters in their war against the Soviet Union. And we were their allies. We funded them. The word Al-Qaeda in Arabic means the base. And the base was a unit, almost like a brigade that the United States was allied with and to some extent funded in Afghanistan with Osama bin Laden as the head of it to fight against the Soviet Union's presence in Afghanistan. And they were considered our allies. And we loved them under Ronald Reagan, talked about them as freedom fighters. He compared them to our founding fathers. And the people in Afghanistan kind of wondered, what happened to you guys? Why did you abandon our dreams of wanting to have our own, democracy, we wanted to fight for our own country against these godless people from the Soviet Union. We thought you were on our side. That history got lost a lot in America. And I think as a journalist on the ground, you heard it every day if you knew how to listen to it, and people wanted to share that with you. And I think it was incredibly important to understanding the story. So this notion of global and local, which I know is at the heart of World Affairs Council, really was central to the way I carried myself as a reporter in the field.
And as you talk about not being at war with the people, but rather with the government, but also knowing that you're approaching these conversations, these conflicts from your own personal perspective. I'm sure you had feelings about the World Trade attack in 2001. How do you, as a journalist, and I think this is important for anyone who wants to understand issues today, how did you set those things aside in order to come at the story from that neutral perspective, or from that perspective that's willing to at least hear the other side, take that information in and aggregate it out into your stories?
Well, you don't really set it aside, I think, as much as you try to internalize it into how you think about the complexity of what you're covering and to bring the human side of it to the story. So for me, I lost friends in 9/11. I remember I covered cops, and so I had a lot of friends who were police officers and firemen who were among first responders in that building when the World Trade Centers were coming down and there were so many deaths. So I knew people who died in the World Trade Center bombing. I had friends who were on the planes from Boston, a very dear friend who was on the plane, and a colleague's father who was on the plane that left Logan and then was flown into the World Trade Center, hijacked and flown in. So I had a very, like all of us who had any touchstone to that, we all have a personal connection to that moment in history that brought us to a war in Afghanistan. But I'd have to say that the tragedies that touched me, when you're watching what's happening to a country that is suffering so many more casualties, such a more intense level of bombing and of death and loss, you begin to contextualize your own personal connections to it. And you start to realize this is a lot bigger than you. And I think that's the moment where you start to really understand it. And I think you never want to allow yourself to forget it, because it's important to keep that in your heart. But you do want to try to open your heart to understand that the people you're covering in these places tend to be going through something that is far worse. And maybe one of the single greatest exceptions in my lifetime of that would be the murder of Jim Foley, which was just so extraordinarily brutal that that one touched me so deeply. I was changed by that moment in a way that I can't ever even think about putting it aside. And I still work with how I internalize it. I think all of your listeners know, but Jim Foley was captured in Syria in 2012, held hostage for 2 years, tortured, waterboarded, and treated horrifically by his captors, ISIS, and then was publicly executed, beheaded, while there was a videotape running, which was then carried and streamed out on the internet. And, watching a friend go through that is a life-altering experience for someone who's a colleague. Now, for his family, who are from New Hampshire, of course, just watching their incredible dignity and strength in the way they've dealt with that is one of the most amazing expressions of truly, of faith, I guess. The faith of the Foley family, the faith particularly of Diane Foley, Jim's mom, and the grace she has shown in trying to work to deepen not only understanding of the different countries where this is happening, but also to support journalists, particularly freelance journalists who work there from all countries, not just America, but she really was big internationalist around the different kinds of journalists who are covering these conflicts, and particularly for freelancers, which Jim was. And I think Diane really understands what her son did. And one of the things that amazes me as a parent, I have 4 sons myself. What amazes me is her ability to never question her son's commitment to his calling, as she would put it. She really felt that Jim literally had a calling to be there and to bear witness to what was happening in the Middle East in the time in which he was covering those countries. And he did. He had it was an almost, he was a very spiritual person, but it was an almost religious experience for him to be there, to bear witness. And I think maybe your listeners know, but he very famously in captivity he was very prayerful, and he would pray with Christians and with Muslims and with Jews. He prayed with the people who were there. And journalists tend to be very secular, and that doesn't go over that big. And I've watched Jim's truth that way. He's very genuine. But the image of him saying the rosary on his knuckles inside captivity, being held by ISIS while being tortured, pretty extraordinary. And the image that his fellow captors shared, because they were released, they got out because they were in European countries that were willing to pay for the ransom money that was being requested in order for them to get out alive. They then told the world, they told me, they told the whole world that Jim would sit near the door of the entrance to the cell they shared. Because if ISIS was going to come in to do a beating of someone, he wanted them to take him first. I mean, I don't know if we can understand the incredible spirit that he had, but that is a true story, and one that I don't think can be told often enough. It's told amazingly in Diane's book, American Mother, where not only does she tell the story of her son, Jim, but she actually goes and meets with the men who killed him. And she tells the story of it. What in my times talking with her about her book, we've done talks together, and I bet many of your viewers tonight have heard Diane speak. Diane talks about, it's not about forgiveness, but it's about a journey toward forgiveness. It's about trying to forgive, which is a requirement of Christianity. And I gotta say, I'm a lapsed Catholic. I come from a kind of classic Irish Catholic Boston family. My mom's faith was very real in her heart, and she got to know Diane Foley, and they were very much kindred souls. As I say, I'm a bit lapsed in my Catholicism, but I learn from Diane every day about the truth of that faith, and she lives up to it every day of her life in the work she does in helping others, other hostages, other freelance reporters. So I know it goes without saying in the state of New Hampshire, but Diane Foley is truly not only an American mother, the title of her book, but an American hero.
Yeah, we certainly can't say enough about the great work that she does. I've got my Foley Foundation, How to Keep Journalists Safe on the Frontlines book on my desk right now. And we really appreciate every time we have the opportunity to chat with her and to work with her. I know they're super busy with the Foley Foundation run this past weekend and coming up in DC. So check that out if you haven't already. One more question from me, and then we'll bring in some of the audience questions as well. Please do scan the code, the QR code up in the top left, if I'm looking at it in the same way you all are, or send us an email or head over to slido.com. You can enter your questions over there. We're really excited to hear from you. For my last question, as we're talking about Jim's ultimate sacrifice, and in a time in which supposedly everyone is a journalist, everyone can pull out their phone, they can capture what is happening, and they can tell their own stories and their own experiences. Is it still something that we should be doing, sending journalists into war zones and putting their lives on the line? Is this important work, or should we just rely on the collective journalism of the community?
Tough question, huge question. I think international journalists play a really important role in going into countries to try to tell the story for their audiences back home. Like, I don't think that should end. I have done it for a lot of my life, and I have colleagues who've done it and do it so well. And it's very important. If you watch the BBC or if you read the New York Times, or I don't know if people listen to NPR or listen to some of the podcasts that are being done from these places by American or Western journalists, they're very important because it's about us bringing the need we have to share and help, when you're doing it right, help your home audience understand. I've never been conflicted about that. I've always felt like that was an important role. That said, I worry a lot about freelancers going in. This is what happened with Jim Foley, is he was in a very dangerous country. And I say this with a tremendously heavy heart because, remember, he worked for Global Post. I had actually left Global Post when he was dispatched in the last time. He was in Libya and got captured, and we got him out. We got him back. And I then left, and next thing I knew, he was back in the field in Syria. And I was so worried about him because I knew as a freelancer, he was so drawn to the story. But as a freelancer, I think all of us were concerned that maybe these freelancers do not have sufficient resources. So I do worry about that, dispatching people in without sufficient resources and getting behind them. We started something called ACOS, a culture of safety, largely in Jim's honor and in the honor of other journalists who were killed in that really terrible year of 2014, which was one of the worst years for killing since this one, where more than 200 journalists have been killed in Gaza through the Israel's war on Gaza. It's been a horrific killing of journalists there. But if you layer it down now to your question about citizen journalism and about the layers of journalism that are being done by so many people now, I believe deeply in that. I think it has a really important role, particularly for the journalists who are from there. Look at the images we get out of Gaza. Those are all shot not from professional Western journalists who can't get in, but from local journalists in Gaza who have risked their lives, an incredible proportion of deaths for the history of the killing of journalists globally. It is by far the highest number ever recorded of journalist deaths in a conflict since 1993, when the Committee to Protect Journalists began keeping these numbers. They're grim statistics, but more than 200 journalists killed. I mean, that is just truly an extraordinary and tragic watershed moment right now. And I think we have to think about that. We have to reflect on that and the sacrifices these local journalists have made. Incredibly important. So I'd layer it that way if you're following me, that I do believe in sort of the classic foreign correspondent model still has a place. I think the much more sacred model, though, is those who are covering their own country and trying to share that story. And now, thanks to technology, the ways in which we can pull those stories out and really see what's going on. And just to do a wild pivot before we go to the questions, which I'm eager to hear, I want to share with you something that might be, I don't know, it might be confusing. It might jar some of your viewers here. But I want to share with you why I don't think that international reporting that we've done from afar is doing its job. And I say this with great respect for the tremendous risks so many have taken for the effort to tell the story as a foreign correspondent covering a conflict. But what I have to say I've observed, what you'd have to be crazy not to observe, is that all those places where we worked, where we risked our own lives and where we saw people lose their lives, like Jim, the places we covered are not better off. All of them are worse off. Iraq, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Libya, Syria, and the list is long. I mean, Syria, yeah, maybe a little glimmer of hope now with the toppling of Assad and the emergence of a new leadership. There are glimmers of hope here and there. But apart from one country that I covered conflict of, I would say the vast majority are worse off. The one country I would say that we actually saw take a journey toward peace and then achieve what I think we can call peace is Northern Ireland. And why that happened is complex, but it's rare. And that's why I think I find myself really drawn back, full circle moment, back to local news, back to recognizing that despite all the experience I've had internationally and globally and covering conflict, I actually think in these really distressing times where it feels like truth is under attack, where it feels like authoritarianism is on the rise, and it is on the rise, in that point in time, I find myself pulling back toward local news, because I actually think local news is a place where you can make a difference. It's a place where you can actually affect change. I think you have a greater shot at it. And I am very involved in local news now through Report for America and through my job as a publisher of my local newspaper. And I really encourage a new generation of journalists in particular to not bypass that experience of being a local reporter. Start there. It's so needed. I think our country, the United States, is experiencing an unraveling like we've never seen before. We're more divided than we've ever been. Now, why is that? I think the death of local news in America has a lot to do with that. We know these things happen when local news dies in a town or in a region or in a county. One thing is voter participation plummets. The second thing is polarization surges. And the third thing is that it's a technical thing, but bond ratings drop because banks don't want to invest in communities where no one's watching the store. This leads me to a calling to the audience to say, support your local news organizations. Really think about local news as this place that can not only tell you what's going on in your community, and it's sacred, but it's falling apart and we're losing it in our country. And when we lose local news, I think we lose those things that bind us together as a country. We lose the ability to share stories of heroes or villains or hold public officials accountable. You miss out on the stories of like a great Friday Night Lights football game where you can all come together around that, or the winner of a math contest, or the girls' soccer team riding to victory, or someone in the community who has done something fantastic that should be celebrated and honored, or someone who's gone through a tragedy. Those stories bind us together as communities. And when you no longer have that local news, we fragment and we fall apart. So I know this is a big full circle way to round out here, but I actually think coming back to how I started in conflict reporting as a local reporter, I find myself back at that important task of being a local reporter. And I wanted to say to your audience, think about that. Think about how you might be able to support your local organization that covers your local community.
I appreciate that, and I'm sure our local newspapers, local news shows and programs appreciate that as well. So I wanted to bring in some audience questions as we are 15 minutes from the end here. And we'll start off with Gala from Georgia, who is asking for any suggestions on how to ensure the news we are receiving and consuming is accurate.
Yeah, great question. I think there's a real need for media literacy. We all need to think about, where are we getting our news? So these days, how do we know what we're reading is accurate? Well, keep going back to the source. I have, my sons would never do this because they know I'd read them the Riot Act, but their friends often say to me something they've read. And when it's a little bit off base, I might say, so where did you read that? And they'll often say, on Reddit. And you say, well, wait. Reddit doesn't produce journalism. It's a platform that carries stories. Or I read this on Google. Well, Google doesn't produce news very often. This is just something that's carrying you the news. You have to know where you're getting it from. Keep drilling down. Know what the source is. It sounds so simple for those of us of a certain age who thought that way. But these days, information is bombarding, particularly young people, in ways that is so fast and so furious that it can start to feel like it's building consensus. And if you can just grab it the minute you start to read about it and really think about where you're hearing it from, I think that's one of the most important filters on making sure you have a kind of news literacy that will steer you away from the misinformation and disinformation that's happening. I talked about the crisis in local news, and there are news deserts all over the country in America. And in those news deserts where there is no more local news organization, I don't know if people know this, but 2 newspapers die in America every week. I don't know if people know that like 2/3 of local journalism jobs have been lost in America in the last 20 or so years. This is a crisis, full-blown crisis, and it's deep, and it's creating what we call news deserts, where no one is covering the local story anymore. And in those news deserts, it's not like that dry, barren soil that's created is just sitting there. It's actually absorbing toxic misinformation and disinformation. That soil is so barren, that misinformation seeps right into it because people don't know where to go to get information they can trust. So again, Report for America is an amazing program. I'm so proud of the team that is carrying it forward. I am a co-founder, but the team is out there now going to new heights. I've stepped away from the organization, and I just watch it in awe, doing amazing work. And I really encourage people to check it out, because you can fight misinformation and disinformation through supporting your local news organization.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're focusing on here is that this is a step-by-step process to understand really anything, and to create those solutions. And those steps start locally and hopefully multiply out globally. I wanted to move next, I think, to Stacy's question, talking more about how we understand truth. Can you talk a little bit more about the ways in which you build relationships on the local level, and how do you ensure they are telling you the truth? And I think that's probably speaking to the conflict journalism.
Yeah. Well, one way you build trust in local communities is through that sacred role that's sometimes called fixer. Again, I hate that word, but local journalists who become guides for us have been invaluable in helping us get inside a story. And it's so important that those local reporters trust you as a person if they're going to open you up to their community. So that sense of trust, I think, begins at that atomic level right there. I think it also comes down to just being honest and being truthful and doing your best to really listen to what's being said and record it faithfully. It's really the only way to build trust. And the other thing is to go out of your way to share it when you can. I used to really love to go back to families that I might have interviewed in a really tough spot and go back with some of the publications that I had written for, if it's a magazine or if it's an audio piece, to bring the recording and to share it with them. These days you can do it so much faster because you can be online and show them this is how the story looked online. It demystifies it. And I think it helps to build trust. And I think we really need to think about this as journalists, that we have lost trust. It's probably the single greatest contributing factor to the decline of American journalism, is that we lost trust in so many places in the world often, but even right in our own backyard. And we lost that trust by not being there on the ground, really doing that role that I would call the ground truthing, right? Getting there on the ground and calibrating what you're learning from human beings, the human reading, compared to the technology. And remember what NASA said: when they're in conflict, when the technology, which is bombarding you with misinformation and disinformation, is telling you one thing, and the human reading that you're getting on the ground is telling you another, as NASA says, when the technology and the human reading are in conflict, trust the human reading. So I think human readings and honoring them are the way you build trust, and the way, to answer the previous question, to really get past this misinformation and disinformation that's so ubiquitous out there.
I appreciate that. I have a interesting question that I wanted to bring in here. Jeff from Sunapee is curious about what is the most challenging part of covering a conflict, and what toll does this take on your overall mental health?
Yeah, that is a powerful question. Thank you for asking it. There's a phrase that is used in some of the work we've done with trauma counselors for journalists who have been through wars, because the trauma you experience is real. And for me, it was very, very real, and took me years to think through, recover from. I still think about it and work on it. But one of the things, a phrase that I've learned that's very powerful is emotional harm. You know, if you see things that are terrible, if you see people being treated terribly, it really can cause emotional harm. And I think the first step is being keenly aware of that and recognizing how it can change you. And I've definitely experienced that. And I would say it then can humble you to realize there are whole countries who have experienced that trauma. If you think about the people living in Gaza, you think about being underneath that level of bombardment and the trauma that causes, and the emotional harm for anyone who witnesses that, whether you're a journalist or it's your neighborhood and you're watching it happen. These are things that are powerful, concussive after effects of war, and they have to be dealt with. And the wars that we are watching now are going to take years and years of counseling for that. Think about the Israeli families who had loved ones held hostage, and who watched while they didn't come home, and who watched while the war went on and the bombing continued, knowing their loved ones are there in that rubble somewhere being held by Hamas. Like, that is a searing trauma. And I think all of these layers of trauma are why war is so terrible, and why war, just keeps reverberating through a society. And it really requires a conscious effort to think about that and to seek out the kind of counseling people will need, both individually and collectively, to heal from that.
Yeah, we a few years ago did a conversation surrounding the idea of communities recovering in the wake of a conflict or a genocide or an atrocity, and we had two really great people who had that background, that trauma-informed background, in order to lead that. So happy to push anyone that way who might be interested in checking that out. Helen is asking us, as a woman, I've always been fascinated by women journalists who cover conflicts. Have you worked with them, and how do you think their reporting differs, or does it?
Great question. And I have to say, people think of this war reporting as this macho experience, but many of the best reporters I've ever worked with in my life were women. There were many of them out there. And I learned so much from the way they saw the war. It was very different. The one who really comes to mind is Marie Colvin, who is an amazing colleague who was killed while reporting. And she was killed during the Arab Spring, and in Libya, hit with a missile attack. And it's believed it may have been targeted too, that they were trying to kill journalists. And I got to say that Marie Colvin brought a kind of, I don't know, just this incredible depth of honesty and humanity to her reporting that I think was very feminine. It was very different than the way a lot of men were seeing the war. And it was disarming, and it was truthful, and it was so important. Lindsay Addario, the famous New York Times photographer, who's written a book, I think I'm God's senior moment, but I think the title is It's What I Do. It's an amazing book of her life as a photojournalist, and having worked alongside her in the field and seeing the commitment she has to this story is extraordinary. Seeing her have that commitment, even when she was in the field and pregnant. She is someone who has consistently brought forward the story of women and their often, undertold stories of suffering inside a war, and what it really does to women and girls, not only when rape is used as a weapon of war, but also when women's rights are eroded in a war, and that becomes a secondary story or a side story. And I think Lindsay would always be reminding us by putting those pictures front and center. And if you think about the famous New York Times photographs of women in war, many of them are by Lindsay. The one I'm thinking of is in Ukraine, the woman who's being taken out of a building, and she's very visibly pregnant, and the rubble of the building that's just been struck is behind her. And it really speaks to the inhumanity of that war, that a maternity hospital was bombed, and this woman is being pulled out with this very much, you can see she's about to give birth any minute. I don't know. Lindsay has time and again reminded us of the powerful eye that women bring to war.
Thank you for that. And I think it, again, really reminds us all that we are humans. We are talking about humans, and that is something that I think can sometimes get lost. So I appreciate when people do bring the humanity into those kind of conversations. But with that said, we're going to move on to technology. We've got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. So I want to bring up, Salazar from Methuen's question. What technologies are coming out that you're excited about in journalism, and what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, wow. These are great questions. Thank you for asking them. This question, I'm trying to think, there's so many ways I could answer, but I mean, the technology is truly thrilling that's happening right now. I mean, the ways in which we can produce stories, the speed with which we can produce stories, the immediacy, the way in which we've democratized the process of telling stories is really exciting. And I feel like we're at an incredible moment of tumult and change. I don't just feel like it, we are. We live in revolutionary times in terms of the technology of storytelling. A revolution that, it's said a lot, but it is really true. We have not had a revolution this disruptive since Gutenberg and the printing press. And that really began in its first phase with the World Wide Web. And when we think back, just think back in your own mind, your own experience, if you are of age to remember what it was like in, say, 1996, when you were first practicing going on Google, and think about how recently that was. That was just one generation away. And think about what that did to transform journalism. And look at where it led us with Google and Facebook leading the charge with algorithms that have left us deeply divided. So pivot, yeah, I'm very excited about the technology, but I'm worried about where it's taken us, because those algorithms that drive those two in particular, Facebook and Google, the two sort of duopolies of the first phase of this revolutionary moment in technology, they captured 70% of the advertising dollars, and they did a lot to destroy American journalism in the process. Now, got to be fair that American journalism was failing and failed to see the business shifting around them. They failed to see the future, traditional journalism. So I don't want to blame it only on the technology companies that did their own jobs and did good work from their perspective. But I do want to say, I think that happened because journalists didn't have a seat at the table. We were not out front enough in recognizing what an incredible moment it was in technology to tell stories in new ways. And the technology won out over the storytelling and the human work of journalists. I think we're in another moment, and a more radically transformative one, and this is AI. And this, to the second half of the question, what keeps you up at night? The idea of reporters not at the table as AI emerges. And we have artificial intelligence shaping the ways in which not only information will be gathered, but how it will be presented to us. You know, they say the age of search is over, and we are now in the age of answers. So if you watch how young people use the internet these days, they're not searching for information. They're asking their computer, what happened in Iraq today? And then their computer tells them what happened. And it cobbles together different sources that they may or may not take the time to read in the source notes. Now, this is both thrilling as an opportunity and horrifying in terms of how we can be controlled and manipulated if we don't have human beings. Of course, we need human-centered AI, but I would argue we even need journalists to be right there at the table, because I think AI needs journalism. Everyone's talking about how journalists need AI. Well, yeah, it will help us do our jobs if we use it right. It can augment what we do. But what I don't think has really sunk in is how much AI needs journalism. And I really want to encourage your viewers to think about this. Let's turn this thing upside down and say, we need a seat at the table this time. So hopefully we can avoid what happened last time. And I'll just go back to that notion of the definition of ground truth, which is when the technology is in conflict with the human reading, trust the human reading. That philosophy of ground truth, to me, and the reason it's the name of our organization, is at the center of how we're going to have to navigate the future.
Yeah, I think the AI revolution, as we talked about earlier this year in our spring series, has the opportunity to change things for the better and sometimes for the worse. And it's really about utilizing these technologies in their right and proper way for positive rather than negative. And I know that tonight's conversation has been a bit of a tough one in terms of some of the things we've been talking about. So I've back-pocketed this question from about 10 minutes ago to hopefully end on a positive note. And it comes from Ryan in Bow, who wants to know, what is your favorite country that you've covered and any positive stories that led to that assessment?
Wow, that is a beautiful question. It's hard to say favorite countries. I am of Irish ancestry, so Northern Ireland had a particular resonance for me. Iran may be one of the single most beautiful countries I ever covered that no one seems to know much about. So you feel like you're walking on the moon. But I would have to say, I think my favorite, the one that's the most searing and important to me, is Israel-Palestine. I lived there with my family as the Middle East bureau chief for the Boston Globe for about 5 years. We lived very close to the line between the Israeli and the Palestinian sides of Jerusalem. And our kids came of age there. We have one son who was about 2 months old when we moved there. And my wife and I had 2 other sons who were born there. One of our sons was born in Jerusalem. And, that's pretty amazing. And because his mom is Jewish, he is a sabra, as they would say. He is someone who could become Israeli if they wanted to, because it is the definition by Jewish law of whether or not you're Jewish. It comes through the mother. And our other son, Gabriel, he was born in Bethlehem in the West Bank. And there in Bethlehem, he was born, and his Palestinian Authority birth certificate said religion, Christian. Why? Because it's the father's religion that determines that. And I kind of love this mystical idea that we lived in a place where I worked as a journalist, and we lived in a way that defied a lot of the ancient and religious laws of a place called the Holy Land. And it challenged my own faith as a Christian. And I watched my wife challenged in her faith too, because our kids were short-circuiting it, right? So I'll leave you with this idea that our kids' passports are this kind of mystical documents. So the one born in Jerusalem, it says city of birth, Jerusalem. And then it says country of birth. And at that point, Jerusalem had not yet been declared the capital of Israel. It was still for the final status agreement of the peace process. And it was under the first Trump administration that Israel was, called officially to name its capital as recognized by the United States, the capital in Jerusalem. We had always had our embassy in Tel Aviv. The Trump administration, the first one, moved that to Jerusalem. That was a very big deal, and very big deal in the Holy Land, and a very big deal in the peace process, because it took a crown jewel of the city of Jerusalem, which is holy to all three Abrahamic faiths, of course Judaism, but also Islam and also Christianity, and it awarded it to one side. And I think that is an interesting thing to look back on. Certainly, I get the emotion of it as the eternal and indivisible capital of the Jewish people, but the way in which that was done, I think we lost something sacred there, perhaps. Hopefully not in the long run. But I do love the fact that my other son, Gabriel, is born in a very holy city for the Christian faith, Bethlehem, where Jesus is born. And there on his Palestinian birth certificate, it said, as I shared, the father's religion defines his, so it says his religion is Christian. But on their U.S. passports, they're both U.S. citizens, even though they have these birth certificates from Israel and Palestine. They have, as I said, the date, it says city of birth for the one born in Jerusalem. I shared with you, it was Jerusalem, blank, because it had not yet been named the capital of Israel. For Gabriel, born in Bethlehem, it said city of birth, Bethlehem, West Bank, country of birth, blank, because the state of Palestine does not yet exist officially, according to the United States, even though other countries are recognizing Palestine. So, mystical moment that I think about all the time and that I sort of love for our own family narrative, but I also think it's an interesting way to contemplate the Holy Land and its ancient laws and how challenging they can be. It's that our two sons were born in holy cities, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, that at the time they were born were not assigned officially by the United States to any country. It makes for an awfully complicated process of them going through customs. But it also speaks to me, at least, as something powerful and important to ponder, which may be that our faith can go beyond national boundaries, beyond checkpoints and dividing lines. And in Jerusalem, I began to really experience that. I'm not, as I shared, I'm not religious. I'm not someone who could say I'm a practicing Catholic in any deep way, but I am very drawn to my faith, and I'm very drawn to others' faiths. And I try to understand what motivates them and drives them. And I think those very personal stories revealed something very special for me about the Holy Land and about Israel and Palestine.
Well, thank you for sharing your personal story about what drives you and what moves you to do this great work that you are doing to help people better understand the world and their local communities and how they interact and engage. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us tonight and being a part of this conversation.
Thanks for having me, Tim. Thanks to your audience. Amazing questions. I'm not surprised with it being the World Affairs Council, but I do want to just say thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who has watched us live here tonight. Those who are watching the recording, we really appreciate your interest, your engagement, and your support. I want to make one final invite for people to join us on November 5th here in Manchester, New Hampshire, for our Global Business Summit consulate reception. It's going to be a great opportunity to get our global community together here in New Hampshire and have some global conversations. And I'm seeing Charlie would like to say one more thing. As I mentioned that our event will be taking place where your niece attended college, St. Anselm College.
And Anselm's awesome. No, I think I would be remiss and I would have colleagues who are very mad at me if I didn't share something with you, which is I write a newsletter on Substack, Ground Truth on Substack, where these issues are continually something that we're reflecting on and writing about. And we're going to share some of the observations here tonight in our Substack. But I really want to invite people. Please join us. Please come and check that out and see what you think on Substack. It's just Ground Truth on Substack. And if you're of a certain age like mine and you might need help getting on Substack, ask one of your kids or your nieces or nephews, because they'll help you get there. And it's a very exciting place for dialogue. And I'd love to continue the dialogue with anyone who is here tonight.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And I'll direct my parents to talk to my kids because I don't know how to do Substack either. Anyway. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed tonight's conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Have a great night.